There's a moment most people experience, but almost no one admits out loud. It doesn't look dramatic. No breakdown. No yelling. No visible collapse. If anything, it looks completely normal from the outside. But inside, something shifts. It usually happens late at night. You're lying in bed, phone in your hand, scrolling without even processing what you're seeing. Or you're sitting in your car after a long day, engine off, but you don't get out. You just sit there, quiet, still, and for a brief moment, the noise stops. No distractions, no performance, no pretending. And that's when it hits you. Not loudly, but clearly, that maybe the way you've been living isn't working. You start to question things you usually avoid. You realize that more money hasn't fixed it. That external validation didn't last. That being busy didn't make you feel fulfilled. And the most uncomfortable part, you can't blame anyone else for it, because in that moment, there's no one else there. Just you and your thoughts. And the truth you've been pushing away finally shows up. That feeling, most people run from it. They grab their phone, turn something on, distract themselves just enough to bury it again. Because sitting with it means facing something real. But what if that moment isn't a problem? What if it's not a breakdown, but a breakthrough? Because that quiet realization, that uncomfortable clarity, might be the closest you've ever been to actually seeing your life as it is. Here's what makes that moment so uncomfortable. It exposes something you've been running on for years without ever questioning it. A quiet belief, one that sounds reasonable on the surface. If things just go right, I'll finally feel okay. If you make more money, if people respect you more, if your situation improves, if life becomes a little easier, then you'll relax. Then you'll feel in control. Then you'll start living the way you actually want. That's the lie. And almost everyone is living inside it. You've been taught this your entire life. Work harder. Achieve more. Fix the outside, and the inside will follow. So you chase. You adjust. You push. You wait, always waiting for the moment where everything clicks into place. But it never fully does. Because every time you reach one level, your mind creates another condition, another requirement, another then. I'll feel better when, I'll be happy when, I'll relax when. And without realizing it, you've built a life based on postponing peace. You've trained yourself to believe that calm, clarity, and control exist somewhere in the future. Not now. And that's why even when things go well, it doesn't last. Because the system itself is broken. You're trying to solve an internal problem with external solutions. And that never works. Because no matter how much the outside improves, your mind stays the same. Still chasing, still comparing, still waiting, until that quiet moment hits again and you realize something simple. It's not your life that's out of control. It's where you've been looking for control. So if the problem isn't your circumstances, what is? It comes down to one thing most people never fully understand. Control. Not the kind you think you have, the kind you actually do. Because right now, you're trying to control things that were never yours. You try to control how people see you, how they respond, how quickly they reply, what they think after you leave the room. You try to control outcomes, timing, opportunities, the direction of things that involve other people. And when those things don't go your way, you feel it. Stress, frustration, anxiety. Not because something went wrong, but because something didn't go the way you wanted. And that gap between what happens and what you expected to happen. That's where most of your suffering lives. The Stoics broke this down in the simplest way possible. Some things are up to you. Most things are not. What's up to you? Your thoughts, your decisions, your actions, your response. That's it. Everything else, outside. And here's where it gets real. You already know this, but you don't live like it. Because if you did, you wouldn't lose sleep over someone's opinion. You wouldn't replay conversations for hours. You wouldn't feel thrown off by things you can't influence. Instead, you would redirect your focus back to the only place where your power actually exists: yourself. Because control isn't about forcing reality to match your expectations. It's about mastering how you show up, no matter what reality gives you. Here's the part most people don't want to admit. You don't just misunderstand control, you cling to the illusion of it. Because it feels safer. It feels better to believe that if you just think hard enough, plan carefully enough, analyze deeply enough, you can prevent things from going wrong. So you overthink. You replay conversations. You predict outcomes. You try to read between every line, every tone, every pause. Not because it works, because it gives you a sense of control, even if it's fake. That's the trap. Control feels real in your head, but it disappears in reality. You can rehearse a conversation 100 times, and it still won't go the way you imagined. You can plan every step, and life will still interrupt. You can try to manage how people see you, and they'll still form their own opinions, because they're not in your control. Never were. But instead of accepting that, most people double down. They think I just need to try harder. So they tighten their grip. More thinking, more analyzing, more mental effort. And ironically, that's what makes them feel even more out of control. Because now they're fighting reality itself, trying to shape things that won't stay still. And the more you fight what you can't control, the more unstable you feel. That's why letting go feels so uncomfortable. Not because it's wrong, because you've been depending on the illusion for so long. But here's the shift. You don't lose control when you let go. You finally stop wasting it on things that were never yours. Even when something happens, that's not what affects you most. It's what you tell yourself about what happened. That's where everything changes. Two people can go through the exact same situation and walk away with completely different experiences. Why? Because of the story. Let's say someone doesn't respond to your message. That's the event. Simple, neutral, but your mind doesn't leave it there. It starts building meaning. They're ignoring me. I said something wrong. They don't respect me. This always happens to me. Now notice what just happened. Nothing changed externally, but internally, everything escalated. Emotion follows interpretation, not reality. And the problem is, you don't question the story. You believe it, automatically, because it feels real. But it's not. It's constructed. Your mind is trying to fill in gaps with assumptions. And most of those assumptions lean negative, because your brain is wired to protect you, not to make you peaceful. So it prepares for the worst, overanalyzes small signals, amplifies uncertainty, creates patterns that may not even exist. And before you realize it, you're reacting to something that never actually happened. This is why you feel drained after certain situations. Not because of what occurred, but because of everything you added to it. The Stoics had a simple practice for this. Separate the event from your interpretation. Ask yourself, what actually happened? And then, what did I add to it? That question alone can pull you out of unnecessary suffering. Because when you remove the story, What's left is usually far less intense than you imagined. And that's where clarity begins. There's one idea most people avoid because it feels uncomfortable. But it might be the most important one in this entire conversation. You are not going to be here forever. Not someday in the abstract. Not as a distant concept. In reality, your time is limited. And deep down, you already know that. You just don't live like you do, because if you did, a lot of things would instantly lose their weight. That argument you keep replaying, it wouldn't matter as much. That embarrassment you can't let go of, it would feel smaller. That constant need to be understood, respected, approved, it would start to fade. Because when time becomes real, priorities become clear. This is why the Stoics kept death in their awareness. Not to be negative, but to remove the illusion that you have unlimited chances, unlimited time, unlimited later. Because later is where most people hide. I'll start tomorrow. I'll fix it next week. I'll become who I want, eventually. But eventually turns into never. And the cost of that delay is your life itself. Every day you spend overthinking things you can't control is a day you don't get back. Every moment you spend stuck in your head is a moment you're not actually living. That's not meant to scare you. It's meant to wake you up. Because once you accept that your time is finite, you stop wasting it on things that don't deserve it. You stop postponing your life. You stop waiting for perfect conditions. And you start asking a different question. If my time is limited, what actually matters right now? At this point, most people understand the ideas, but very few actually live them. Because knowing the truth and practicing it under pressure are two completely different things. This is where the separation happens. Not between smart people and average people. Between reactive people and disciplined ones. Because when something triggers you, when someone disrespects you, when things don't go your way, when uncertainty hits, your default pattern shows up. For most people, they react. Immediately, emotion takes over. Thoughts spiral. Energy gets pulled outward. They lose control of the only thing that was ever theirs. But a small percentage of people handle that moment differently. Not perfectly, but intentionally. They pause, just for a second. And in that second, they create space. Space between the event and their response. And that space, that's where control lives. That's where strength is built. Not in avoiding difficult situations, but in how you meet them. Because staying calm when everything is easy doesn't mean anything. Staying grounded when things get uncomfortable, that's different. That's trained. That's earned. And over time, those small moments compound. You react less. You overthink less. You recover faster. Until one day, you notice something subtle. Things that used to control you don't hit the same anymore. Not because life changed, because you did. And that's the shift most people never reach. They spend their lives trying to control the world, while a small group learns to control themselves. And in the long run, that's the only control that ever mattered. At the end of all of this, nothing outside of you has changed. The world is still unpredictable. People are still inconsistent. Life is still uncertain. That part never goes away. But something else does. The way you relate to it. Because once you truly understand this, you can't go back to living the same way. You can't unknow that most of your stress came from chasing control you never had. You can't ignore how much energy you wasted trying to manage things outside of you. You can't pretend that later is guaranteed. So now, you're left with a choice. Not a dramatic one, a quiet one, the kind you make every single day. You can keep reacting, keep overthinking, keep chasing approval, keep trying to control outcomes that don't belong to you. Or you can start shifting, moment by moment. You pause before reacting. You question the story in your head. You redirect your energy back to what's yours. Your actions, your mindset, your standards. That's it. Simple. Not easy, but simple. And the more you practice that, the more stable you become. Not because life gets easier, but because you stop depending on it to feel okay. You stop outsourcing your peace, and slowly, you build something most people spend their entire lives chasing without ever finding: internal control. Because, in the end, this was never about controlling the world. It was about realizing you already had control of the only thing that mattered. The question is, are you finally ready to use it?